Hey everyone. So I'm gonna give a little backstory to this before I go on explaining my main thing, which will be, what exactly makes a weapon OP and like how exactly could that be showed. So the backstory is I woke up this morning at about 4 a.m. and I looked on Discord and I had a ping about the new video that L made, which was of him showing just him using Ogress. And I'm pretty sure that the main point of that was to show that Ogress was OP. But of course, with the people I was talking with on Discord at the time, we pretty much agree that that doesn't really show anything. And I will explain why exactly in a bit. So then I got onto Warframe just because I didn't really have anything else to do at the time. And then I decided to play some Conclave, and I got into this session that I'm showing gameplay of here. So this is like first thing when I woke up, so you'll see that like this, like that's the perfect example of me being like really clumsy because I'm tired at the time. But in the match after this, I definitely warm up a lot, and I do end up winning that match. That is besides the point though, because as I'm going to explain in a bit, that doesn't really show anything about a weapon being OP, whether I win, whether I lose, whether L wins, whether he loses. And so, I ordered this, and I decided to upload it with commentary that really explains, what I said I'm going to explain, what makes a weapon OP. So I did touch on this in a different video where I compared what do you call it, static core and Ogress as examples, where they're both AOE projectile weapons and stuff, but like one is obviously a lot more powerful than the other. Like I don't think anyone would really argue that static core is overpowered. And definitely a lot more people think that static core is overpowered than people who think that Ogress is overpowered. And the same way, you could also take weapons like Toncore and Angstrom, which are also projectile AoE weapons, but if like anyone's like ever used them, it would be pretty obvious that those are not overpowered by like any stretch. I'd even say that they're underpowered. And so like the reasoning that a weapon is overpowered just based on the fact that it's AoE or like even the size of the AoE, that reasoning itself just doesn't work very consistently. Just because there's always a way you can show that to be wrong. So something that does work is simply comparing the usage of various people with that weapon. And I'll explain with some examples here, like with I think static core is actually a good example for this, where you can see that a very wide variety of people play better with static core than they do with whatever else they usually use. So like you'll see pretty consistently that people who use static core just overall do better, and it's not because they're good with static core, and that is showed from the fact that a very wide variety of people pick up static core for the first time and do well with it. And so it's really the ease of power that the weapon brings. And so static core is really an example that shows itself, and I think weapons that are overpowered do tend to show themselves as overpowered just because people tend to gravitate towards them. So like we've seen this before with with how blade whips used to be, everybody would use them because they gave so much power in comparison to how much skill that was needed for them. We've seen this with the slow hammers. The slow hammers laws. We even see it with some of the slow hammers still, but not nearly to a degree. So whether those are overpowered or not is a bit debatable. But we're seeing this with static core. We saw this with hammers laws. We saw this with Daikyu. We saw this with blade whips. We've seen it with a lot of other things. And so the reason why something like Ogress is different is because, well, you see a pretty limited amount of people using it, and people who aren't those limited amounts of people, like Haki and I being the main examples, they generally don't really do well with it. And that really leads to my main point of what exactly would change my opinion, which would be to show that people can generally do better with Ogress than they do with other weapons. And so, for example, let's say someone mainly uses something like Snipetron Vandal. Let's say they'll average maybe 18 kills a game with a 2-1 KD ratio. Just as an example, you can insert whatever stats you want. And then they use Ogress for the first time, and they get let's say 22 kills per game with a 3-1 KD ratio. If that's something that is seen consistently with people, it's just various players of low, mid, whatever skill levels. Then I would very much change my opinion that it's not overpowered. If I saw that, I would say well, it seems like Ogress really is overpowered. Now, I don't think that will happen, but if anyone does, if anyone does think that would happen, this is something that I would very much like to be showed, because if I'm wrong, I want to know that, and this would be the most surefire way to prove me wrong. And so I think I said just about everything I've needed to say here. I'm gonna let the rest of the gameplay go. And actually, one last thing. This applies to any weapon too. So if you think anything is overpowered, you can find ways to show that people generally do better with this weapon or with this warframe than they do without it, almost regardless of how much experience they have with it. Obviously, if someone has tons of experience with one thing and then they switch to something else, they're not going to be as good with it in comparison. For example, me with Oberon, if I were to switch to another frame, I probably wouldn't do as well as I do with Oberon, because I don't think I've ever actually made a video where I wasn't using Oberon. Which mainly just goes to show how much I use Oberon, where you could look at my stats having 59% usage. And so if I were to switch to a frame like Rhino, I might not do as well. But that's because of a pretty extreme gap in experience. Nonetheless, one person doesn't make that sort of difference. I could be horrible with Rhino, and yet I could still say he's OP. And if I find that people do generally do better with the Rhino, my single example of skill just doesn't matter. It's supposed to be a pretty widespread evaluation. And in the same way, someone who is really experienced something should be expected to do better with it. So if you ever look at my stats, Ogress is my most used primary weapon. I think it's actually even my most used weapon in general. And so, of course, I would be expected to use Ogress better than most other Ogress users, just because I've used it so much more. And in that same way, my personal skill with it doesn't matter for the comparison of whether or not it's OP. You have to compare a wide variety of people's usage with it, and it can't really just fall on to people who have used it a lot or whatever. It has to be a wide variety. And so like I said, anyone who thinks Ogress or any weapon is OP, you can just find a sort of variety of people to help you test that, and with just a moderate effort, I think you could show that to be true if it actually is true. And if it's not, then you won't be able to show that. So that's all I'll say for now. I'm just gonna let the rest of the video play, and I hope you enjoy.
Remains. 30 seconds remain. 10 seconds remain. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You have won this annihilation.